If you're a subscriber to the Social Regressive, you've probably already seen a video that I did where I tested these Leapers UTG 30mm Quick-Detach Rings. They have this nice little lever here to see if you put a scope through these things and then put it on top of a rifle, and then if you were to take the scope off with these attached, reattach it later, does it come back to zero reliably? And in that test, I pretty well proved that yes, these things actually come right back to zero. I've never had any issues with these. I've actually been using them for years out varminting, and they work great. I take them out to the desert or wherever, and then I can just pop the scope on and off, and no issues. Everything comes right back where I need it, and I've never had any zero shift or anything like that. Now, I actually really like UTG products. I think they make some really good stuff. The quad rail, I know that this is kind of an older model, this kind of basic quad rail instead of the nice sleek forearms that people are making nowadays. But it's still good and reliable. I've used this for a while. This bipod is also a UTG, and yeah, it's a little bit floppy. It was super, super cheap, but it works great. I keep it on there. It works really well. This mount right here on my Bushnell TRS-25, also a UTG. This is one of the thumb screw models. So I like UTG stuff. But I do have to point out that there is an issue with these rings. And actually, it kind of applies to all of their rings and mounts. There is one design flaw that I'm going to show here that didn't really show up until I started shooting a larger caliber than a .223. I hadn't used these kinds of rings on something bigger before, so let's see what happened. This is our Savage Axis project rifle. This is an attempt to turn an inexpensive deer rifle into a long-range precision rifle, and to keep the budget really small. The original budget was about $500, and even with that budget, it pretty well worked. Check out the playlist over here on the side. And what we're doing is we're starting to get into some better parts, because there was one part that was really holding everything back, and that was the scope. With a better scope like this Falcon M18 Plus, this is producing much smaller groups. So I took this out the other day to give this a test and to get it all zeroed in. And you can see right now that the rifle scope is sitting in these Weaver 4-hole kind of skeletonized rings. These are aluminum, and I really like these rings so far, by the way. So if you're looking for a decent ring for a 30mm scope and you want the budget to be pretty small, then we have these. These seem to be pretty nice so far. But what I did is I grabbed some Leapers instead, because I didn't have these available. I grabbed them from the drawer, popped them on here, and I got everything, really tensioned down pretty good. They should have been pretty tightly attached to this base, just where I could barely get those levers popped off. And you can see what happened under recoil. This is a 7mm 08 rifle. So its recoil is, basically the same as a 308. And you can see that it damaged that section of rail right there. And I've already filed this down just a little bit so that, I was trying to see maybe I can still use that bit of rail, but no, I don't trust that little section of rail anymore. I'm not going to use that, which is kind of a bummer. Really, at some point I'll probably just have to throw the whole base out, because you can see that now this ring is not in the optimal position. I would like to have it just one notch forward, so that I can just have more control over the scope. I don't like to have my rings really close together. But now that section is damaged and I can't use it anymore. The typical design for these stops is squared off, like you see on these Weaver Quad Lock. I also have some Weaver Grand Slams that have the same thing. So this is going to present a nice clean front to bash up against those rails if there's any movement, and it's just going to make everything lock up a little bit tighter. So what's going on here? Taking a look at the underside of these rings, you'll see that the stop, this bolt that runs through the center, is rounded, and that it's very likely that less than half of it is poking up above the surface. So you're getting just a minute section of this stop coming up against the rail. And if there's any kind of looseness in the system, and especially as the optic or whatever is mounted in here gets heavier, then every time you fire the rifle, this is going to batter against that rail, against a very tiny part of it, and it's going to peen the metal. And this isn't just relegated to this particular ring, it's actually on all of their mounts. As you can see here, this is a riser that they have, and this has 2 of those rounded sections again. Also, that Bushnell TRS-25, the special riser that I picked up so that I could get absolute co-witness with my sights, rounded. I had noticed a while back that the scope ring at the front of my scope was doing this to my AR-15 Picatinny rail here, and so I tightened things up just a little bit further to make sure it didn't happen again, and it has been halted. It hasn't produced any more damage, and you can see that the spot right here where I normally put my red dot, there really isn't much damage to see here. I don't think it's done anything at all. For one thing, that red dot is lighter, the scope is heavier, and I have made sure that everything is tightened up. There is one big difference between this riser that I have on the TRS-25 and the quick-detach scope rings that you see in the background there. This has just a big nut that's very easy to turn, and this is going to make sure that it locks up really tightly. You can put as much tension as you want on this thing to attach it to the rifle, and then you just apply the same amount of tension the opposite direction to turn it off. So this, you can really crank it down pretty good. This, on the other hand, is a little bit trickier. These are very clever. You've probably seen these, kind of cam action levers before on other mounts. But you're trying to find a balance between a tension that's going to hold this ring on the rifle and something that you can actually remove and put on again later. So it really takes some work to get this thing turned to the correct position. This has an Allen set screw right here, and this is what you use to get that tension going. And then the cam pushes that plate up against the rifle. It gets this little lock in place. And so this has its limitations, and one of them is that once you have cammed this into its final position, on some of these newer ones, this is an old one, this is an extra high mount that I got a while back, and it seems like the quality has kind of fallen off. This one was pretty darn good. This one didn't want to float around. These new ones, however, that I picked up, it seems like the cam is not as well ground as the old ones. It could just be my imagination, maybe the other one is more broken in, but this one, once you get it into its final position, it's like you're kind of breaking over this lot of tension, and then all of a sudden it kind of slacks off and backs off. And I don't want that. I want the maximum tension to be when this is actually pressed down into its final position. So these, they didn't really work out that well for me, and that's, I think, is how I got this area peened right here. So what's the final takeaway? I wouldn't recommend using these UTG rings or risers on any centerfire rifle that's bigger than .223, for example. They really need to redesign this thing with a squared off bumper instead of this rounded one. Really, for anything like, say, .22-250 and up, I would expect that this would cause some real damage to your bases or to the Picatinny rails that are on your ARs and that sort of thing. I really want to like these, and I will still run this on my .223 AR-15 back here because I do have the tension, finally dialed in just right on this. It shouldn't cause any more damage here in the future. And I do like the way that the rings work. These little QD mounts are actually pretty slick, and they do, like I showed in that other video, return to zero just fine. But just because there's such a high risk of damaging parts, I'm going to pass on these. Now, I really do hope that they do improve these in the future, because I do like the design. I like the price point. Naturally, if they do more milling where they're squaring this off, the price may go up a bit, but it'll still be a steal. And these things will, I anticipate, still work really well. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to like, share, and most importantly, subscribe. Even if you didn't like this particular content, go ahead and subscribe. There's probably something coming that's more up your alley. Check out this playlist right here. This is going to have videos in a similar vein to what you just watched. These 2 videos we cherry-picked for you. And finally, the Social Regressive is on Patreon. So you can become a patron of the Destructive Arts and earn some goodies while helping us to provide high-quality videos just by kicking us a few bucks a month. Thanks a bunch for your patronage.